This is Writing Weekend. Writing is a practice met daily, either on the page or off. These two exercises will help you find balance in that practice. I'm going to write with you. 2 minutes on the timer. Let's go. Who are you? So this is all about identity, and I love looking at this aspect. I really feel that when you start to align yourself with your identity, things really begin to take shape. So, how many of you out there walk around calling yourself a writer? It's really interesting. When I was doing a workshop just the other week in Nottingham, and I had a group of writers, and a few of them there were saying, no, I don't tell people that I write. I don't tell people I'm a writer. And so I said to them, what would happen if there was someone who really wanted to be a doctor, but they kept it secret? They were like, I really want to be a doctor, but I'm not going to tell anyone. We don't really imagine it happening in a profession like that. And yet it seems totally acceptable to be a secret writer. So I really want to bring all you secret writers out of the shadows, because you're telling yourself a really mixed message. Here's a part of you wanting to write a book, but here's another part of you saying, I'm not a writer. So your brain is like, whoa, what do you want? Do you want me to write a book, or do you want me to not be a writer? And then you're wondering why you're not getting around to it. So we've got to start calling ourselves writers if what we want to be doing is writing. So a lot of people say, look, I don't call myself a writer because if I say that I'm a writer, then the next thing somebody says is, oh, are you published? So we're going to explore that. We're going to explore that moment. And we're also going to explore what it would take to enable you to call yourself a writer. So both of them are kind of linked, because a lot of the answers to what would it take to call yourself a writer is getting a book published. So I want to explore the area of what would it take, but that thing is something that you have complete control of. Because what would it feel like? You've got this thing that you really want, but it's completely out of your control. It's like, I really want to be a doctor, but I'm waiting for someone to come along and say, yes, my son, you can be a doctor. So we want to take that power back into ourselves. I really want to be a writer, and I don't need anybody else to come and tell me that I am. I can just decide that for myself. So this is the first 2 minutes that we're going to look at. What would it take to call yourself a writer? And when I say what would it take, I don't mean something coming externally, like a publishing deal or getting an agent or winning an award. What would it take in here? What would have to shift in the heart, in the chest area? What would have to shift up here for you to be able to call yourself a writer? 2 minutes. Okay. So what would it take? This was an interesting one for me because I reflected that way back over a decade ago, I bought myself a laptop. I went and moved to Mexico and I began calling myself a writer. I had a laptop. I was going to write a play. So whenever I met people and they said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a writer." Because there I was in Mexico with a laptop to be a writer. So I was reflecting, I was like, well, what enabled me to call myself a writer? And I put, how was this? And then I wrote, I'd gone all in. I'd walked away from my life in London. I had this sense that, my CV was never going to recover from these years that I was going to spend in Mexico. So I didn't really have anything to come back to. I had taken myself past the point of no return. I'd gone all in. And I think that was a really significant moment when I was doing this exercise. Not only that I'd gone all in, that I had chosen that. I chose that life, no regrets. So what did you discover? Did you discover that there was something internally that you could shift that was going to enable you to say, I'm a writer? Or did you get to a place where you're like, I still feel like I need something external? So again, as a life coach, I know that this is always a negotiation. Working with identity with a client is really deep work. But just to plant that seed that as soon as you start to shift what you're calling yourself and what you believe and feel about yourself, you're going to find yourself doing actions, taking on habits that are really aligned with being a writer, being an artist, whatever it is that that identity says about yourself. So we've looked at what it would take in here to enable you to say, I'm a writer. I want to now look at that question that I know a lot of people dread. If I tell people I'm a writer and then they say, are you published? I just hate that. It's such a drag. And obviously for most of those people who are saying that, the answer is no, they're not published. And so it feels like this absolute cliffhanger. They've taken themselves right to the very edge. They've put themselves out here. They've said, I'm a writer. And then right across the sky, this big question, but are you published? And it's like, no. And then there's this big plummet over the cliff, this real sense of failure. I didn't deserve to call myself a writer because the one question that I was asked after singing my identity to the universe, I couldn't answer. So let's go back to the doctor analogy. When you meet a doctor at a party, you meet someone and you say, what do you do? And they say, oh, I'm a doctor. Do you immediately say to them, have you saved someone's life? Because to be honest, if you haven't, then I don't care what you do each day. I don't care how much you've studied. In my eyes, you're not a doctor. So I want you to reframe the idea of being asked that question, have you had something published, as being a very innocent question. Being a question from someone who doesn't know. They don't know what it is to be a writer. All they know is that there is a shop called a bookshop, and that shop sells books, and those books have been published. And those books have been written by writers, so writers get published. They don't understand that being a writer is a career that is so diverse. I call myself a writer. I've had short stories published, but I also call myself a writer because I sit down every day and I write. I call myself a writer because I'm always thinking about ideas, I'm always coming up with ideas, I'm always being creative. So for me, calling myself a writer isn't about being published. It's about having an identity that I know this is what I want to do and I know that I'm never going to quit. So this question that can knock us for six, have you been published? I want us to start to look at it in a different way. So imagine that you're calling yourself a writer and imagine that person nodding as you say that and imagine them saying, oh, have you been published? So I want us to spend the next 2 minutes exploring What would you need to believe about yourself, about the fact that you're a writer, about your ability to write, whatever it is? What would you need to believe in order to make that question completely okay? And in order to make the answer have absolutely no significant consequences? What do you need to believe to make the question, have you been published, completely okay and have no significance at all? 2 minutes. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this was an interesting one. I've been working with this technique that I started to write about with a few clients recently. Not in this specific area, but it felt like a transferable technique. So I started off writing. If people ask, "Have I been published?" it would just be like a sound, a doorbell, something that signifies someone is there. So I've taken all meaning out of the question and just made it into a huh. No words, no implication, just a sound. And that sound is like, oh, hang on, there must be someone there. I've just heard something. And so then when you hear the doorbell, you're like, oh, well, I wonder who's there. I better go and have a look and see who's there. So it's a sense that that's how I respond to the question. Have you been published? Huh? Oh, right, well, I just heard something, so who's there? And there's suddenly a curiosity about the person asking the question rather than oh God, well, I don't really want to talk about the fact that I haven't, or the fact that I haven't published what I want to get published. Suddenly, my attention is on the person, not me, not how I feel about me. Suddenly, I'm curious about them. And so I put, perhaps I might think for a moment, and I might take a moment to collect myself, and then begin to get curious about what the person knows about writing. Do you read much? I might ask them. And as I wrote this, I was imagining the other person. They know they've asked me a question. They know that I've answered that question with another question. They could be thinking a whole number of thoughts. They could be thinking, oh God, that was a really inappropriate question to ask. Oh, silly me. You don't ask if a writer's been published because that's really private. They want to be private about something like that. And then they start to answer my question. And actually what they might turn around and say is, actually, no, I don't read anything. I don't really understand what it is to be a writer. And then you're like, oh, well, that's why they're asking me the only question that they can think to ask. It's not the universe saying, how dare you call yourself a writer because you've never been published. It's simply just a person standing in front of you going, I've never met a writer before. What do you actually do? And so suddenly the question becomes innocuous, and we're able to take another step, another day with that identity of, I'm a writer. I'm a writer. I'm a writer. So take that through into your weekend, that simple phrase. Try it out. Try it out at breakfast. Try it out when you go to bed. I'm a writer. And see what difference it makes. And I will see you next Saturday.